So one of our last group of plants is the ferns and their allies. Different group of plants entirely. These are not flowering, they're seedless, they have vascular tissue, and they make spores. So let's meet some of these guys. There are plenty of examples around Washington State, and certainly if you go to the west side of the Cascades, then you would have far more abundant examples, large groves of ferns and other fern-like plants. But we have plenty on the east side as well. Some of them growing in rock crevices, some out in the open. They vary quite a bit. So let's just take a look at a few and see where they fit in with the plant kingdom in general. So it's this branch over here. We haven't tackled that much. We've really looked mostly at flowering plants. We had taken on the conifers. We're not really going to take on the mosses, and a lot of people mistake ferns for mosses, but mosses grow really short, like a carpet on the ground, whereas ferns grow taller because ferns have vascular tissue. So that means they can take that water and send it up their stems and get off the ground, unlike mosses. However, like mosses, they produce spores, not seeds, but spores, just single-celled, tiny little bits of dust that have to land somewhere and grow into a new plant right away. In that sense, they're like mosses, and that means they have to maintain some of their life near quite a bit of water because those spores are fragile. A lot of ferns actually have swimming sperm as well. Probably not something you expected from the plant kingdom. Another reason they need to be near water. One of the most likely ones you'll run into is bracken or bracken fern. And so this is a subgroup of the fern family. It's a true fern. It's a deciduous plant, as you can see here on the lower left from the deciduous leaves. Large frondy leaves. The spores come out of little structures on the underside, so no flowers to look at here. And this one spreads really well through rhizomes, those underground stems. And so you can see it on the right. This forest has been opened up by fire, and these ferns are loving all the extra light and just spreading like crazy. So bracken can actually get kind of out of control. Some people try to treat it like a weed, and it can be. So bracken fern is a really common one to run into. There are plenty of other ferns I could talk about, but I chose Oregon woodsia just because it's a great example of a dry adapted fern. Something really kind of unexpected. And this is in the group called the cliff fern family. You can see why. Look at it growing over here right in the rocks. So this one doesn't usually produce fronds much over a few inches, at least the ones that I've seen. And it will grow up in the mountains, but well down into the foothills as well. They have, the upper side is pretty glossy green, very recognizably fern-like with all those dissected parts. The underside of the leaves, you can see kind of just below here, the undersides are kind of woolly, so they produce these hairs. That's also where the spores are produced. So this one is green even well into summer, which is remarkable for a ferny plant like this. They have these perennial roots that usually are deep into some sort of rock crevice. Very often they do better in more shaded locations, so they're not out there in the full sun in the hottest part of the day. But even to remain green into midsummer for a fern, I find remarkable and seemed worth talking about, the cliff fern. Horsetails are an interesting group of plants. So they're one of those fern allies. They're not really a fern, but they're in that group of seedless vascular plants. So they do produce spores. Some of their vegetative stems come up like these guys here, and they actually have silica, which is sand, in their cell walls, which gives them another name, scouring rush. So if you're out camping and you forgot a scrubber and you need to scrub some pots, you can actually grab one of these, and they do a pretty decent job of scrubbing off all that food junk. But then they send up different types of stems, like these on the right, that produce spores, and those spread and land and produce new plants. And they can spread pretty well. So you can see over here, this entire area is just covered by scouring rushes, or horsetails. They have kind of a unique appearance in that they're on the stem, the leaves come out in whorls, not something we've seen a ton around here. And you can actually kind of pull them apart at the joints. They have hollow stems, and that gives them a kind of distinctive appearance. Looks like little pine trees in a way, or horsetails, as the name suggests. You'll find these most often in wet areas, sometimes by streams, but even sometimes just leaky irrigation lines. These can actually become kind of a weed in some agricultural settings. Another fern ally, again, not a true fern, but a fern ally, is the club moss group, or Lycopods. You don't see these a lot on the east side of the Cascades, but if you get up a little bit higher in elevation in some protected valleys, you will find these. Now, don't let the name fool you. It's not a moss. It's still a fern-type plant. It's more like a fern than it is like a moss, I'll put it that way. The simple leaves are a little bit different than the flowering plant or conifer leaves. There's less of a complicated structure, and it gives them kind of a moss-like appearance. But sometimes the female partners get fertilized and send up this sporophyll that kind of looks like a club. And so that's where it spreads the spores from, and that's where it gets its name, the club moss. Sometimes they're called ground pines as well. They do look vaguely like something weird happened to a pine tree and caused it to just sort of grow on the ground. But if you see something like that, probably a club moss. Another one in the club moss group, kind of the same sort of lycopod group, is the spikemosses. There are examples of these that they call resurrection ferns. They don't look like much. I mean, here they are in all their glory. They don't produce flowers. They produce spores just like the others, but they often really close up all those leaves and weather the drought that way. They'll grow out on rocks most commonly, usually up in the forested habitats, sometimes down in the foothills. And when it rains, they'll open up those little leaves and photosynthesize for a while, and then as it dries out, they just kind of close back up to protect themselves. Again, a lot of examples here that you wouldn't really peg as a fern, not like the sort of lush ferns you witness over on the Olympic Peninsula or anywhere west of the Cascade Crest, but here's the east side version of ferns. A lot of interesting stuff out there to behold. Hope you enjoyed all of those, and until next time, happy botanizing.